Welcome back to part 2 of my deep dive into Sega's MegaCD, an augment back in the 90s that really extended the lifespan and kept it competitive until it ended and was replaced finally by the Sega Saturn. Now, like the Sega 32X, it was potentially a machine that had more potential tapped inside that was never fully exploited by the developers, including Sega themselves, due to the chaotic nature of Sega at the time, desperate to keep the Megadrive going with different parts of the business across the world pulling in various directions. Here I dive into the games themselves, the best and worst the console had to offer. If you want to learn more about the hardware, how it delivered what it did, where it came from, and its reasons for being, then please check out part 1. But let's dive into the very best and worst we saw on the spinning discs of the Sega, and start with a game that was really a lawn unto itself. Virtual reality was trying to take over the world in the 90s, and hard to believe we're still here now trying to realise that potential. That didn't stop Nintendo and Sega trying to dive into that market, with Sega nearly getting a VR headset out at the time, but thankfully that never happened due to the illness that would have followed suit. It was a bit crap, as was the film and game. Now, unlike many titles at the time and we see nowadays, this was actually a very different title between the Super Nintendo, the Sega MegaDrive and the MegaCD. The platforming versions on the standard consoles used some 3D effects at the beginning to work towards the mission, and then some terrible platforming action beyond, but at least it was something that was standard to the form. The Sega MegaCD instead tried to push all this into the real cinematic FMV type affair, with pre-rendered graphics, and away you went flying down tunnels and other odd events during the film itself, and it really didn't flow coherently or have any kind of enjoyment. And the restrictions on the movement, the timing, and the insta-death that you can't skip without a terrible game over screen left it as being a terrible game overall on the MegaCD, and even though it used the video functions well and the sound effects, it's a really crappy game, and it's worse to play than the standard platforming action on the base consoles. So if you do see this lying around in a shop in a retro event and think, a Sega MegaCD title, I'll pick that up, this is certainly one of the games that sits on the worst the Sega MegaCD had to offer.
At the center of the problem is the huge gang known as Mad Gear.
Moving from one of the very worst to one of the very best, Final Fight CD was a real enhancement and almost an arcade perfect port back in the day when that was quoted far more often than it ever became true. But the Mega CD really enhanced it and was by far the best version on a home console you could buy. The infamous version on the Super Nintendo forced a second release, Final Fight Guy. Sadly, that only replaced the main Cody character with Guy, still giving you only 2 characters to play with, single player only, a reduction of only 3 enemies on screen at once, cut back on the levels, and most of the animations between scenes and breaking through doors and levels is completely removed. It was lacking quite a lot. Sega made a big deal of this at the time, launching Final Fight CD, licensing it from Capcom, and adding all those elements back in. We had a perfect arcade port, all the characters, an additional time mode, intro, voiceover acting, and all the additional elements of the intro screens, and 4 characters on screen, well 5 including your own, and 6 with the 2-player mode. That was quite a big enhancement. Due to the sprite limitations of the Super Nintendo, the Mega Drive never suffered anywhere near as bad. And the only real sacrifice from the arcade version is it's not quite as smooth, especially on the PAL version, and it cuts back the on-screen characters from 4 to a maximum 10, which the arcade version you can see here side by side. It's very, very close, and Final Fight was a huge arcade game at the time. It had a CD soundtrack which was excellent, speech, and a much better intro sequence. And it was certainly one of those games, one of those early games that was censored, and everyone knew it back then without the help of the internet. The Japanese version here at the beginning, Hager's daughter Jessica takes on more of a Madonna-style affair of clothing than she does in the Eastern releases. Aside that, there are some changes to character names and other elements of clothing throughout the title, and this was an early sign of games being changed between Western and Eastern audiences. It's still a cracking game and certainly up there as one of the winners on the Mega CD. Wonder Dog was actually a MegaCD title second, and then later ported to the Amiga. But in actual fact, it started life as a JVC produced exclusive for its own licensed hardware from Sega, the Wonder Mega. Now you can see the name link this had, and the game screams 90s dude all over it, with Mario and Sonic being the big driving mascots for their companies. JVC wanted its own for the Megadrive, MegaCD MIDI and karaoke device in one. Core Design stepped up to the plate with this cute English and colourful platforming adventure. The game begins with a fully animated intro that Core made themselves famous for on the Amiga, even dedicated entire discs just to this cause. But thanks to the CD format, they could add much more into that, and the game with sound and music being strong enough to look good in screenshots and moving along. Parallax layers are extensively used, with line scrolling giving great depth to movement in this detailed cartoon-like world. As the hero suits up to save his planet, K9, with a super suit borrowed from Earthworm Jim, he sets about throwing stars, killing bunnies and saving his owner. It makes little sense, and at the time was well in line with the market, but it has not aged well, being quite slow and boring at times to complete levels. With minor changes to powers such as hovering ears, it does not add much over the cartridge format, aside the animations and sounds, which were a common occurrence on the MegaCD. Like the machine, it did not achieve the sales levels hoped and was later published alongside another Core Design game in Wolfchild, which followed more of a Switchblade style edgy and arcade shooter cum platformer. Now this is a better game, with you collecting altered beast like orbs to go Super Saiyan with laser blasts as you traverse the varied levels and destroy all that crosses your path. Sadly though, this was again a game that is good then but not great now, as a few levels in the variety and extremely convoluted level design overall can have you backtracking and falling more often than I would personally like. It is a better game then and over Wonder Dog, but most of these games have not aged well and do not really offer a great deal over standard cartridge games of the same, aside some bells and whistles which were quite common at the time. Core Design were a big name on the Amiga and ST scene at the time. Contrary to internet reports, they never really existed until Lara Croft was released, and they were widely known way before that, loved and enjoyed throughout the 16-bit era, and thanks to the strong links with Sega over the Mega Drive and certainly the Mega CD, it gave them key links into Tomb Raider on the Saturn, which was the lead platform. Both are far from terrible at all, but they are forgettable enough that they do not stand out on the format over so many other great games, and for that, I class them in the stinker pile. Now, Heart of the Alien is a bit of a mixed bag, an exclusive sequel that included the first Another World, or Out of This World in the US, and its new alien-centric game that the title comes from. It was only released in the US and was quickly distanced by the original developer, Eric Chai, as not true to his own vision of the game. That aside, it is still a great extension and review of the original game. Starting directly after the events of the first, it flashes back to the tale from the alien's view, and then plays out the revenge story for the red-eyed alien that destroyed his village. It still uses the same polygonal constructed models that are fully rotoscoped to deliver smooth, lifelike and cinematic motion throughout. The effect, popularised in games like Prince of Persia, was a method ahead of its time, with current motion capture being the modern equivalent of now across most AAA and even indie titles. Now, back in the early 90s, it was a revelation to have real-time, smooth and fluid human motions captured in such a way that allowed full three-dimensional control of the captures transferred into vertex points and vector motions. The strong leaning on cutscenes and set pieces does give it a limited level of replay, but it was a game that stood out for its style, bleeding-edge tech and animation, with a solid yet tough game underneath. Much better than the flux of FMV games the console had, as it was still a game that balanced the two fields much better, and in many ways is still the style of games or modern A titles that we would go for right now. As such, it's not aged as much in design and gameplay as it has in the visual and presentation levels. The limited 3D options of the Megadrive and the Amiga Atel at the time does limit the speed, but at least the new CD format enhanced the music and sound effects over the Megadrive original, which was not as good as the Amiga original. In fact, even the CD enhanced version here has worse music for that intro than the Commodore machine. But it's still a great addition to the MegaCD and exclusive collection the title has, aside obviously the fan-released Amiga port that was reverse engineered from this Sega disc. But it sits somewhere in between as a classic and a tough game to play, but it still warms my heart enough now to sit into the good pile, maybe not the biggest winner.
Okay, Captain, let's knock him out of New York.
One of the biggest genres was FMV, and collectively they are mixed, they do have certain styles, but overall they're all pretty poor as a game. Technology-wise, they use combinations of real-time footage or pre-rendering images over the top, pre-rendered graphics in FMV, or just a combination of background video and then overlaid sprites or digitized sprites. These combination of titles ran things like Night Trap into things like Sewer Shark, and then they kind of got a little bit better in terms of understanding there needed to be more gameplay involved. So games like Ground Zero, Texas or Corpse Killer enhanced these better by having an Operation Wolf style affair as you scrolled across the screen, shooting digitized characters coming at you, or in the sense of Ground Zero, more in the lines of Mad Dog McCree with pre-rendered footage running out in front of you and then just shooting them and jumping straight to the shot of the character being blown away. It did play slightly better, and they certainly got better at using the technology to be more reactive, more enjoyable, and more dynamic. Night Trap, for example, did use a lot of sampled speech. The PCM sound chip of the Megadrive or MegaCD was used here, instead of using and pulling data straight from the CD, because the limited speeds there and the functionality meant you couldn't stream footage and sound at the same time, because it would limit the functionality. The biggest reason here in MegaCD though, land, or at least on Night Trap, was the fact that they were using that to change the colour code in the game. So the game actually doesn't stick to the same routine on which colour you need to use to activate the traps. So in certain parts as you play the game over, the dialogue used has been recorded to say orange, blue, purple, green, whatever, dependent on how randomised it is when you play the game.
Not that again.
Come on, Studley, we better change that code.
How about green?
Sure.
So this does add a level of replayability for the game, but you would really be pushing yourself out to replay these games over and over again. They did have enhancements. They were really the only place where the 32X enhancement boosted the quality. Things like Corpse Killer here is enhanced and has much better quality colours. Obviously 256 colours was the most common level you would see on the 32X, but theoretically it could display 32,768. But the screen size was the biggest improvement. It may not be a huge leap in resolution, but the colours, the size of the screen, and it does look a hell of a lot better on a CRT screen. It still looks pretty poor on an LCD, but then these games weren't designed around those, and it was a sizable increase. Unfortunately, no other game really took advantage of the combination of the Megadrive, the 32X and the MegaCD, which could have been quite a hell of a combination at the time, maybe even giving the Sega Saturn a run for its money. But that never happened, sadly. The FMV craze did die out, and sadly we don't really have a classic to look back on, and they've aged pretty poorly now. But at least they stand as a testament to what was possible back then, where it was all about those cinematic joys.
Your mission, protect those 5 girls from whatever happened to another bunch of teenagers. They disappeared after spending a night at the Martins. Last night, one of our agents got into the house and found a weird security system. Hidden cameras in almost every room and a series of traps. Our agent spliced an override into the security system, enabling you to control the cameras and the traps with this remote unit.
Megan. Oh, come on, everyone. I want you to meet my parents. Huh? Oh, look at Megan!
Now, we've moved from one stinker to a winner. There was quite a lot of platforms and action titles that luckily got released on the machine. Sonic CD was a cracking game and certainly one of the better Sonic titles overall. Made at the same time or before Sonic 2, hence no Tails in this title as it was made in parallel. This was a game that used time travel well. It used the CD format with an excellent soundtrack, using that additional space to draw multiple versions of the same level, and using the scale and rotation effects for the special stages, which were then mimicked in the latest Sonic Mania title. It's a great Sonic game, and even though it was made in parallel, sits well along the Sonic heritage, certainly as good as Sonic 1 and Sonic 2, with lots more options and replayability available there, but it doesn't flow in terms of the sequence because of the way Sonic 2 moved on with the tales and the characters. This is kind of an odd one that sits outside of the canon, as you would call it, of the overall Sonic world, if you really care about that kind of stuff. But it's a great addition to the Mega CD catalogue, and it's still quite cheap to pick up.
Hey, Dusty! Hey, just wanted to thank you again for pulling us out of that Aztec tomb!
Character-filled platformers and mascots was still the craze, and everyone wanted a piece of that action, so somebody somewhere decided to make Wild Woody and release it on the Mega CD, and it is a stinker of epic proportions. The intro sequence that uses the FMV quality and pre-rendered graphics is terrible. The animation's bad. The plot is a bit weak, but that's typical of 90s games anyway. And then you took on a character which had very much in line with the Pepperami character that was advertised back in the day, if anyone remembers that, which had the voice from Vivian from The Young Ones. It feels like that character, but it's just horrible to play. The level design, the graphics are very bland, the soundtrack's not very good. It's really a game that didn't play well then and does not play well now, and I can only recommend it as one to totally avoid. And it's one of the worst titles I've played on the Mega CD that really does nothing more than add a really crappy intro at the start, but there were a collection of titles that did that across the board. One special mention is a overall winner, and probably one of the better teams across the Mega CD overall, is Core Design. The UK-based Derby company was an absolute masterclass in how to utilise the Mega CD hardware. It really took the scaling and rotation effects of the machine and pushed them up to as far as you could possibly imagine they would go. And even though I think a combination of 2D and 3D was the best mix, and there's another game I'll cover in a moment that touches on that ability, they were the ones that really utilised that hardware best and showed you something that really wasn't capable on other machines at the time. Remember, the Super Nintendo only had the ability to scale and rotate tile-mapped backdrops and not sprites. Taking a game like Super Return of the Jedi here, you can see in the speeder sections, ground is smoothly scaling, but the characters and sprites are just different memory sizes jumping up as they get nearer the screen, which was a common trick in the 16-bit era. Not so on the Mega CD. Everything smoothly scrolls towards you using the X and Y coordinate, and then again applying that to the characters themselves to scale and rotate on the coordinates gives you a smooth and fluid title that was really something you didn't see outside of arcades at this level. Yes, the frame rate was restricted down to 17 or 20 FPS, but it still looked very impressive indeed. The team's origins on the Mega CD actually improved and refined what they did on the 32X. BC Racers was the title that was released on both. You can see the alterations to the depth of the screen, the size of the characters, or where the viewport is, but also the 32X is actually slower but more consistent. It updates both the sprites and the background at the same time, whereas the Mega CD interleaves the background and the sprites together. They refined and improved this engine even further with titles such as Battle Corps. Games like Thunderhawk really stood out as a title that allowed you to fly around your own helicopter with varied backdrops and missions, blowing things up, and it felt like a leap forward in terms of hardware before we got our hands on the next generation of 32-bit consoles.
Incoming bandits. Incoming bandits. Incoming missile.
Culminating in Soulstar, which is the best one they released overall. It has that English style and the presence there, and it's effectively a 2D shooter like Gradius or R-Type, flipped in to the Z-axis, allowing you to fly into the screen and play in a very similar fashion. This was something that was obviously mimicked to other titles such as Sylpheed, which again used pre-rendered backdrops, mixing that up with sprites overlaid on top. And even though it doesn't play as smooth and look as impressive in terms of what it's doing with the hardware, it was still a good looking title back then on the Mega CD, and at least utilised that FMV functionality with the games and the limited colour palette to give a very pleasing looking polygonal game overall, even if it wasn't rendering those polygons in real time.
There's too many of them!
Mega CD was home to many exclusive titles and shooters across the board. One of the better ones is KO Flying Squadron, which takes on the role of 14-year-old Rami Nakahikari, who flies along, and it's all based on Japanese culture overall. But what other game but from Japan could you be flying along shooting dogs on flying carpets, suicidal birds, or suicidal rock divers? It's a strange affair, but it has a distinct style and theme all its own, this wacky eccentric style certainly mimics such classics as Gradius and certainly Parodius on the PC engine. But it feels good to play, it's got a good speed, it swamps the screen with action, and again you can got power-ups, and the levels play out by going vertical and horizontal as you play through, going through caves, even having a shift from daytime to night on the first level. Visually it's very clean and uses the additional space of the Mega CD to improve the animation frames of the characters in the title. It's a cracking game and plays very well, and obviously is a collection of 3 games which pushed onto the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation.
What a fool you are! It was totally your fault, you know that! You really should... I guess you'll never learn. Well, listen, Rami, until you get that key back, you will get no food!
Wait!
That's right! No key, no dinner! You'd better hurry and chase them down!
I hate this. Hey, Spot, we gotta go. Spot? Are you still sleeping? Wake up!
Now, another exclusive title, and I would say a better use of the hardware, was Robo Elise. This is an excellent game and follows over from the Musha series on the Megadrive and is a sequel to that title. And it plays brilliantly, but it has limited glimpses of brilliance in terms of using the hardware, which I feel is one of the sacrifices the Mega CD never had a chance to push on. Some of the levels use sprite scaling during the sections as you start or go to the end of level bosses. Now I feel that this is one area the MegaCD really had the opportunity to push on and impress, such as we saw in games such as Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo. The ability was there, and here, at 50 FPS or 60 FPS in Japan and America, it would have been a smooth and fluid title using sprite scaling to mix up some of the enemies, and the backdrops would have really added a great deal to the title overall. It's still an excellent shooting game, again based in Japanese culture, but has a more realistic style to it, albeit with mech robots flying over different enemies. It's a tough one, but an enjoyable one, with much shorter levels than in the prequel on the Megadrive. And again, it's another title that is exclusive. Now, before I hit what I class as the #1 title on the MegaCD, I have to hit some honorary mentions. The Terminator is a superb MegaCD title, much better than the crappy Megadrive one with you running around lobbing grenades at hunter-killers in a suicide mission and then respawning TA-100s coming after you with huge laser cannons down corridors. It's just a terribly designed game that does not feel great to play. The MegaCD version has a great rendition of the Brad Fiedel Terminator soundtracks, complete with the crisscross credits, but it sounds much better and cleaner, if not an identical port from the film itself. But in game, you've got some excellent 90s tracks which really take you back to some of the rock music back then. Even a Skid Row style level 2 music tune in there. Who remembers that band watching this video? It's a great title, and it plays brilliantly on the MegaCD, and with the FMV sequences and the flow of the Reese character running through the game and the plots of the film, it feels far more coherent and like a game that was designed around the film. Remember though, this came out many years after the 1984 Terminator original. Other titles such as Rise of the Dragon are again great titles on the MegaCD and have aged brilliantly because they play so well now. These graphic adventures with all the style noir that was added into them, being very adult in theme. That was one of the big draws of the game. I remember this on the Amiga. I didn't play it on the MegaCD at all, and I didn't really know it came out on it until later in 2005, I think I found out. So this was an exclusive outside of the UK. We already had this on the Amiga, but obviously the extra touches to the game, the visual quality and the soundtrack and digitized speech or sampled speech is much better throughout the title, and it makes it more enjoyable to play. And like I say, it's a good aged title because it still feels engrossing and engaging due to the cerebral context of working out the puzzles, going through the game and flowing in a logical fashion, and that noir Blade Runner style theme that it has throughout.
Get out of my... Listen, Uptown, unless you got something for me, get out of my face.
Now, if you were into role-playing titles back then and you knew Sega, then Shining Force series really held a special place for many of us, and it was a brilliant game to play. And I remember picking this up on the MegaCD at the time. Now, I have tried to play this recently, and unfortunately it just shows how your mindset changes over the years, and certainly your lifestyle. It's still a great game with excellent story and flow, and it really is a huge game to play with brilliant soundtracks, great animation and comedy all linked in with that turn-based combat system. But unfortunately I just don't have the time or patience to play something like this with a turn-based system that can really drag on for 10-15 minutes per section just to move into the next screen. It's a brilliant title, and I'm really classing this as a winner overall, don't get me wrong. But it's a tough title to play now due to the time you need to enjoy it. If you have and you do enjoy these role-playing titles, then I think Shining Force is the absolute beacon of what was possible in terms of role-playing titles on the MegaCD, and is one that you shouldn't miss out on, even if it's getting quite expensive now. there are a collection of other titles that really use the hardware well. Things like Mortal Kombat enhanced it with better sounds and graphics, and you had other titles that were nothing more than just a port over from what was available on the consoles, adding nothing more than a slightly better soundtrack and sprinklings of FMV. So I'm not going to dive into all of those, a collection of some you can see flashing before your very eyes. So we are at the point now where I have to pick my number one title. These have not been in order, but I do think this is the pinnacle of what you can pick up and enjoy on the MegaCD, not only for then, but it's the one that's aged the least versions to now. And that is the classic Hideo Kojima title, a man that is revered as much in the 80s as 90s as he is right now. One of the longest running creators in the business that has endured over the decades, generations and formats to tell his own unique tales pulled from pop culture. Snatcher is arguably his very best work, being the enhanced and most improved version on the Sega machine, which is the only Western version released. It started life on Japanese computers such as the MSX and then was later ported to the PC Engine CD-ROM. This version added speech, better graphics and an extra act, which really added to the game. It is also the full uncut version with the Western release that hit the Europe first and then the US in '95, having many elements cut or altered. This included nudity and some Stalker or more Stalker-like moments and Snatcher-like moments that Gillian Seed the Star involved in. The one sacrifice was the reduction colour palette of the Megadrive, still limited on the MegaCD to that 61 colour. This was the maximum you could expect, but thanks to the lack of fast-moving 50 or 60 Hz action, the shadow and highlight mode was used here to draw it much closer to the PC Engine's 256 maximum, with around 112 on-screen limit. Now this largely manifests as slightly lighter tones over the NEC machine. It is a product that is clearly based on the seminal Blade Runner film, and like that was a post-loved classic that has become more celebrated, admired and respected long after it was released. Shared with another film on our list here in The Terminator, which this game also borrows elements from. The tale is a clever mix of memory loss for your character, branching dialogue, detective investigation and deep character building that draws you in. Now, Hideo himself was not involved with the MegaCD port. It was handled by Konami teams that included the light gun use that had been released to the Lethal Enforcer game prior. Now, mixing up great sound, speech and moody art, this all stands the test of time now, achieving the perfect balance of cinematic flair and engaging gameplay that with the FMV games failed with. Ironically, this was the first idea they had for the CD port, but thankfully we were saved from another chore of a game and instead have one of the best, most enjoyable and timeless games of the format that is exclusive to boot outside of Japan. Now, I have much more to cover on this game in a dedicated episode to come, but if you own a MegaCD, you have to own Snatcher. It is simply a work of art, and I feel is Hideo's best effort of storytelling than any other game he's made to date. A clear winner through and through, and certainly one that puts the MegaCD that has a library that still offers excellent replayability and potential now, and it's still a great machine that you can pick up and dive into games you may have missed back in those days.
We're getting out of here!
Sorry, I cannot go with you!
What's wrong with you? Hurry it up!
I am incapable of locomotion!
What on earth are you blabbering about? Let's go! It's gonna blow!
Please save yourself! I am paralyzed with fear!
Oh, I can't believe this stupid robot! Come on!
Anyway, that's the end of my MegaCD dive. If you are interested in more, please check out my part 1, which covers the hardware in depth, just how it came about and what powers it. But for now, I'm off to play more retro titles. Leave your comments below and always keep it Sega. I'll catch you on the next one.